It didn't mean anything to me until I got there. Because, it's just some ideas somebody had, and, it's only been 2 or 3 years. It didn't really mean that much to me. Paul McCartney is the most successful songwriter of all time. Together with John Lennon, they formed the legendary Lennon-McCartney duo, penning hundreds of classic songs in the history of world music. Yet, behind the dazzling glory of the Beatles, the relationship between McCartney and George Harrison, the group's guitarist, was far from smooth. Paul himself once admitted in an interview they had disputes so severe that George walked away. Their relationship remained fractured for many years, rooted in one of Paul's misguided decisions, a choice that ultimately helped bring about the band's collapse. What happened between the two? And after everything, how did Paul McCartney try to salvage this relationship? Paul McCartney had a turbulent childhood. His father made a living as a cotton salesman while his mother was a nurse and the family's main breadwinner. But when Paul was just 14, his mother died of breast cancer. The shock not only tore apart Paul's childhood, but also cast a dark shadow over his entire family. Later, in many interviews, Paul would still choke up. "My music is thanks to my mother. The song Let It Be is the clearest proof." He explained that the title came from a dream when his mother appeared and gently said, "Let it be." That message became a guiding light, leading Paul through his grief and into music as a form of healing. Paul began practicing guitar with the cheap instrument his father bought him. But the path was not easy. He was left-handed, while the guitar was made for right-handed players. So Paul reversed the strings and patiently practiced note by note. This difference later became a hallmark, shaping Paul McCartney's unique style. Then, one day in 1957, fate led Paul to meet John Lennon at a small church performance. John's charisma and confidence on stage captivated Paul. After a brief conversation, they realized they shared the same burning passion. John, with his sharp artistic instinct, quickly recognized Paul's talent and invited him into the band. Soon after, the first songs were born, laying the foundation for the legend called the Beatles. Not long after, another crucial piece fell into place: George Harrison. Paul knew George from their school bus rides. Both attended the Liverpool Institute after passing the 11+ exam. Yet they were stark opposites. Paul was diligent, avoiding trouble, while George was rebellious, seeing school as hell on earth. Though labeled useless by teachers, George had a natural gift for guitar. He could mimic complex riffs overheard on the radio, impressing his peers. Paul quickly noticed this and decided to introduce George to John. At first, John hesitated. Could a 14-year-old really measure up? But an audition on the upper deck of a bus changed everything. George played raunchy flawlessly. His skilled fingers made John nod in approval. From that moment, George officially joined the Quarrymen, but the shift was bigger than that. The band was no longer just an amateur group for fun. A creative triangle had formed between John, Paul, and George. They began moving beyond cover songs, writing their own. From those modest beginnings, the Beatles slowly took shape, destined to change music history forever. Still, their collaboration wasn't always smooth. Behind the glory, friendship didn't always remain intact. Few people know, due to clashes in songwriting, Paul McCartney and George Harrison endured long-standing conflicts that left cracks not easily healed. In 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It wasn't only a creative milestone, but also marked a major shift among the members. Before this, John Lennon was seen as the band's soul. But by the time Sgt. Pepper was made, the balance of power had shifted. Paul McCartney gradually became the leader. George, the youngest member, longed to be recognized as a true songwriter. After years of being just the guitarist, he began writing more songs, and some were brilliant, like Within You Without You, 1967. Yet, in Paul's eyes, George's works were not on par with Lennon-McCartney. Paul was known for being a perfectionist in the studio. He often dictated how others should play, even George, who already had his style. This made George feel disrespected. At one point, George snapped, "You play the guitar, and I'll show you how to play the drums." In 1967, when Brian Epstein, the band's beloved manager and emotional anchor, suddenly died, the Beatles lost their direction. Paul tried to take charge, proposing the Magical Mystery Tour. But the project drew heavy criticism, further straining the group. George grew frustrated, feeling like an outsider dragged into plans he didn't believe in. By 1968, during the White Album sessions, tensions exploded. Paul's perfectionism meant he repeatedly demanded George play exactly as he wanted. George felt stifled. After a heated argument in the studio, George walked out. He later returned, but the crack in his friendship with Paul had already formed. From then on, George distanced himself and sought validation elsewhere. Eric Clapton, who admired his music, became one such ally. Clapton even played guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, proving George didn't need Paul to showcase his talent. The rift deepened during the Beatles' 1968 trip to India for transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George initiated the trip as he was deeply drawn to Eastern philosophy and seeking spiritual enlightenment. But not everyone shared his zeal. While George immersed himself in meditation, Paul kept talking about the next album. Already feeling sidelined, George refused firmly. "We came here to meditate, not to discuss business." George no longer wanted to be swept into Paul's ambitions. For him, music was not merely a ladder to climb, but a vessel for spirituality and liberation. Tensions continued. In 1969, when Paul proposed leaving Apple Records, the company they co-founded, as their home, George vehemently opposed. To him, it was a betrayal of their shared ideals. This disagreement, coupled with years of being overlooked as a songwriter, deepened the fracture. While Paul increasingly became the captain of the Beatles, George felt like a reluctant passenger. It wasn't until Abbey Road 1969, their final album, that George's songwriting truly received due recognition. His two songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something, became classics. Even John Lennon admitted Something is the best song on the album. But the recognition came too late. For years, George had lived under the massive shadow of Lennon-McCartney, with his work constantly dismissed. His frustration boiled over in a bitter exchange later recounted in the biography Paul McCartney many years from now. When Paul reluctantly admitted, "This year your songs are at least as good as ours," George retorted sharply. "That's a myth. Most of my songs this year were written last year or earlier. Maybe I just don't care anymore whether you like them or not. I just do them." The conflict between Paul and George wasn't only about ego or control. It was rooted in opposing philosophies of music. Paul's obsession with perfection led him to micromanage every detail. He wasn't shy about telling George how to finger chords or play melodies. For George, it felt like being shackled. An artist yearning for expression, forced to see his ideas smothered by Paul's dominance. Increasingly, George felt less like a musician and more like a shadow following orders. In a 1974 interview, George said bluntly, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. With all due respect, he's a great bass player, but sometimes he's too overbearing. I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney. It's not personal, it's musical." That was the outburst after years of being stifled in Lennon-McCartney's shadow. George stopped waiting for recognition. He realized he had his own voice and soul. Even if it meant leaving the Beatles, he was ready. For George, creative freedom was worth more than glory. Paul McCartney always held a special affection for George Harrison, often calling him his little brother. He would fondly recall their Beatles memories, but admitted their relationship fractured in the late 1960s. Paul tried multiple times to reconcile, especially during post-Beatles meetings and the Anthology project. Yet he also admitted George wasn't always easy to work with, showing how deep-rooted their differences were. Their story demonstrates how unrecognized talent, excessive control, and the yearning for independence can break even the greatest band. But it didn't end there. After the Beatles split, George and Paul's solo paths opened new chapters with surprising turns in both music and their relationship. George and Paul after the Beatles. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, George Harrison finally had the opportunity to step out of the shadows of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Previously with the Beatles, he was only allowed a maximum of 2 to 3 songs on each album. So when he was finally free,